with Shami Chakrabarti and Peter Brierley, who I will introduce when we turn to the panel. So, without further ado, Matt, I thought we'd give you 5 minutes to sort of set out a summary of what you're saying, the main arguments in the book, and you know why you felt you needed to write it.
It's so good to be here with you all. Thanks for inviting me. Good to see my good friend Omar. And it's really an honor to meet new friends and people I respect so much. So I grew up poor, and we often got our gas turned off, and our family's home got taken before it was all the rage. And I think that experience provoked me to kind of devote my adult life to understanding poverty in America. And I've lived in very poor neighborhoods in America. I lived in a mobile home park. I've lived in a rooming house in the inner city of Milwaukee. I've spoken to union reps. I've pored over statistical tables. But like even after all that, I still didn't feel like I had an answer to why there's so much poverty in America. 38 million Americans can't afford basic necessities. That's like the population of Australia. 1 in 3 Americans live with $55,000 or less a year. That's not officially poor by our metrics, but what else do you call that when you're trying to raise 2 kids in Miami on that salary? Why? Why is there so much poverty in the richest country in the history of the world? So I set out in this book to kind of answer that question, and I wanted to answer it in a different way. And I think one way to describe what I was trying to do is to quote this line by the novelist Tommy Orange. And he writes, "These kids are jumping out of a burning building, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is that they're jumping." And when I read that, I was like, man, that is a perfect encapsulation of how we talk about poverty, at least in America. So much attention has been on the poor themselves, work and welfare, their neighborhoods. And we've ignored the fire. We've ignored who lit the fire, who's warming their hands by it. And so this is a book that really does try to get to the bottom of why there's so much poverty in this land of dollars by focusing on the fire. And it makes an argument that some lives are made small so others may grow. If poverty persists in America, it's not a sad accident of history. It's not a result of moral failing. It's a result of a larger moral failing of those of us who are protected and college educated and privileged in America, benefiting from all this poverty in our midst. We benefit through exploitation that we permit in the labor market, and the housing market, and financial markets. We benefit from a lopsided welfare state where we give the most to families that need it the least and really subsidize affluence over alleviating poverty. And we benefit by our continuing embrace of segregation. We build walls around affluent communities, and we hoard opportunity behind those walls. And those wealth traps breed poverty traps. That's the fire. And so then the book, the last third of the book, really builds out a case for how we can end poverty. I don't want to treat poverty, I want to cure it. I don't want to reduce it, I want to end it. I think the ideal poverty rate in a country as rich as the UK or America is 0. And so how to do that? So it's a movement for deeper investments in low-income communities, rebalancing our welfare state. This isn't an argument about redistribution. It's an argument about less rich aid and more poor aid. And then it's an argument about confronting unrelenting exploitation of the poor through empowering the poor by giving folks more choice about where to work, where to live, access to their money. And I bet Omar and I will get into the nitty-gritty specifics about what I'm talking about here. And then our walls, they just have to go. We have to finally embrace inclusive communities and broad prosperity. How do we get there? That sounds like a very pie-in-the-sky, idealistic thing, but let me just give you one statistic and then one note of hope, and then let's talk. Sound good? So, a study came out last year that showed that the top 1% of income earners in America just paid the taxes they owed, not got taxed at a higher rate, but just paid what they already owed. My country could raise an additional $175 billion every year. So that's almost enough to lift everyone above the poverty line. We have the resources, we can clearly do this. That's not the hard part. The hard part is building political will. But here I think there is a lot of hope. And the hope for me is in mass movements. The hope for me is in the movements that are stirring in America, demanding better wages, better pay, more housing justice, inclusive communities. Movements are what forced America's hand in the 1960s to pass civil rights legislation, to build a modern welfare state in terms of the Great Society and the War on Poverty. These are programs that cut the poverty rate in half. And movements are something that can bring us hope today. So that's my book in a nutshell. That's a 5-minute book summary.
Yeah.
And really looking forward to digging in with you and just having a broad conversation about these issues.
Great, that was a compelling and I think inspiring vision of a no-poverty world. And I should have said that this is being hosted by Trust for London, and we're a foundation. I'm the incoming chair of Trust for London, and we're a foundation that seeks to tackle poverty, but more, I would say, by ameliorating the causes of it. And I was curious, in terms of, I see two arguments in your book, and maybe we'll talk about them separately. One is around the policies that we need, and the second is around the movement building that we have to get there. Yeah. And then I guess, and a third argument, which is around, and you even said it in your introductory remarks, that there's almost a moral failing in our failure here. It's not merely a question of the right policies, it's the question of the right motivations, and for whatever reason, I was really struck by the language of moral decay in the book. But I thought maybe first, I know it's not what you're saying, but exactly, but what sort of top 3 policies would you like to see changed that you think would start to make a difference?
So number 1 policy is tax fairness and enforcement. So that statistic that I just gave about, we could just make this massive dent in poverty if we just had correct tax fairness and enforcement is top of mind. Like, just to give you, like, $175 billion is like a number, it's like hard to, like, what does that even mean? Yeah. That would, like, triple America's investment in affordable housing, and then we'd have money left over. Or we could permanently fund the child tax credit that my country rolled out during COVID, which cut the child poverty rate in half, in 6 months, in half. We could do that with that money. So number 1, tax fairness and directing the money downward. Number 2, building policies that make sure that we don't just accommodate poverty, but disrupt poverty. So a lot of our policies in America, our biggest policies, are just plugging the holes, right? They're like, people get paid low wages, we're gonna top those wages off. People can't afford a place to live, we're gonna subsidize that rent in the private market. Those are incredibly important policies for folks that are struggling, but they don't attack the root causes of the problem. So number 2 is we need policy interventions that empower workers. So I'm really hot on sectorial bargaining, for example, organizing entire sectors of the economy or unionizing. I'm very hot on ideas that expand choices around housing, finding ways of investing deeper in public housing on the one hand, and finding ways to get folks into home ownership opportunities that actually make sense on the other hand. So just more choice, which means less exploitation. And the third policy that I think is incredibly important is to really invest in integration. And you can do this through policies in a very effective way. So New Jersey, the state I live in, has a law that requires every municipality to build its fair share of affordable housing. And if municipalities don't do it, the courts can literally rezone their town to get affordable housing built. And so they have this big incentive to be like, okay, we're gonna build these, or we're gonna zone these neighborhoods for affordable housing. And so every suburban jurisdiction in New Jersey has affordable housing, and it's the most economically diverse state in the nation because of this law. So I think turning away from exclusionary zoning, these walls that we've built, which defines most of American land, and toward more inclusionary prosperity.
Yes, I was really struck by that argument around integration and the way in which your argument, and I think is correctly, identifies a lot of well-off people almost deliberately don't want to see poor people. They don't want their kids to go to schools with people like that. And so in addition to the policies, I felt, as I said, there was a sort of moral argument. So how do we, the well-off now are arguably engineering those walls. They're not just being built, by the state even, right? So communities are deciding to build walled communities. Communities are deciding that they don't want certain kinds of children educated with their children. So in addition to movement, I was curious, how else are we going to convince the people who, on your account, need to give up some of their benefits now to do so?
Yeah, I think one thing we do is connect with their fear. And I think the left, at least the left in America, is pretty bad at this. You know, so like last year, the number one issue for Americans was inflation. You guys call it the cost of living crisis, which is a much better phrase for it. And, you know, Americans were like, I can't afford gas and eggs. And Democrats were like, it's really democracy that you should be worried about, you know? And the right was like, yeah, that's pretty scary. And, you know, that's a scary thing, isn't it? And I think that, so like if you put most of your family's wealth in a home, and you think that wealth is going to be compromised by an affordable housing development in your neighborhood, like it really makes sense that you would say no, even, you know, no matter your politics. And so I think connecting to that fear and really going into it and saying, okay, how can we do this in a way that doesn't harm you, that doesn't bring you harm? If you build any kind of crummy housing is going to decrease your housing value, public, private, whatever. So if we do scatter site developments, if we maintain it, it has no effect on property values. And we can leverage a bunch of research to make that case. But I also think, to get to your moral argument case, I do think we have to make an emotional case and a moral case that says something like, look, what we're asking for, like the reason you're scared is because we've created these nations where you can ascend to great heights, but you can also fall to great depths. And you're scared that your kids aren't going to have that security. You're scared that you need to like design your life to just pour advantage into your kid to make sure that they're going to be okay. And an America without poverty is America that's safer. It's an America that doesn't have that fear. It's an America that's happier, I feel. So I do think that we're asking folks to give up something, but I also think that we're going to get something in return.
Yes, and I'm reminded also of sort of Martin Luther King Jr.'s argument that not only do we need to end racial discrimination, but we need to end poverty. It was the third being that we also need to end war. Those were his three ideals. But it also makes me reflect, and it's a key argument, I think, in the book, on one of the challenges is arguably that a lot of white Americans are not willing to share with black Americans. Yeah. And that one of the reasons why there's a weaker welfare state, and one of the reasons why you see these walls, is because basically of racism or of an unwillingness. So we might be willing to design some of these policies, but the moment that you remind some white Americans anyway, or many white Americans, that this is a racialized issue, you reduce support for those policies. How do we get around that? That's a specifically American problem, but I'm going to come to the panelists in a moment and talk about it in a British context, because obviously we're not free from these problems here either. Yeah. But I was curious if you have any thoughts on how do we tackle that problem?
Yeah, I think one way to tackle it is to lean into the economic issues. You know, there's a little scene at the end of the book where I was talking to organizers from a group called One Fair Wage in the US. They're a group that wants to end the sub-minimum wage in America, tipped work. And they were holding this rally in Albany, New York. And they had this giant statue of a black woman, and it was mostly black and Latino women arguing and pushing the state capitol to end sub-minimum wage in New York. And it was also the day that the New York legislature was ratifying Joe Biden's election. So there was a Stop the Steal protest. There were Trump protesters there, white guys in red hats. And so they came over to this group and they were like, what are you protesting? What's this rally? Because they were protesting the election. They were like, it's stolen. And they were like, well, we want to raise wages. And they're like, oh, we're all for that. And they joined the rally. And so in Washington, and maybe it's true in the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the electorate is incredibly polarized. But on the ground, there's a lot of commonality and connection when it comes to basic economic issues. Yeah. And so I think that leaning into that is one solution. But also leaning into movements. It's kind of, as a writer, you're kind of in this paradox, right? Where you're writing to spur empathy and debate, but also like if that's your theory of change, you're kind of like a little naive, right? And so I think, you know, when the civil rights movement happened, it's not like most Americans were for it. right?
No,
When the war on poverty was passed, most Americans were against it. Most Americans didn't want the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, and certainly not the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which took massive urban unrest to move Congress's hand. So I think sometimes you just have to push, right? And you have to blow past where the empathy levels are.
I'm going to come in a moment to, I have someone on my right who is in the House of Lords and someone on my left who's involved in movement building, so I might pick up those threads with them. But one last question for you before I do that, which is around the question of integration. And in London, we have arguably less segregation than in the US, but we still have an issue particularly around schooling and housing and neighborhood. And we also have an issue, and I'm curious how, it's another challenge of integration, which is around gentrification,
Yeah.
and I mean even around here. So how do we ensure that in seeking to integrate neighborhoods, right, so it doesn't appear that it's just well-meaning, well-off, middle-class people coming into a neighborhood, saying that they're doing good, but actually making prices so expensive, changing the culture, or even the look of a place, the kinds of shops, the kinds of architecture, the kinds of public spaces,
Yeah.
the kinds of interactions that are expected in, say, the local cafe, who gets hired.
Yeah.
How do we do that in a way that's, empowering poor people as opposed to, making well-meaning middle-class people feel good about themselves?
Right. Yeah. So I think that I'm going to get to that question in just a second. But when we talk about the UK-US comparison, the US is like, we lose that battle, right? We're just like, well, we don't have a right to house people in the US. I was doing an interview yesterday and someone said, US level of depravity. And I was like, okay. But we don't shut people's heat off in the winter. We don't do that. I've lived with incredibly poor people in the wintertime and they couldn't afford their heat bill. And we don't go into their homes and put like a meter that they have to prepay. We don't do that. Mm. So gentrification is this really hot button issue,
yes.
especially in a city like London. It's also pretty rare. It's a hot button issue in cities like New York and San Francisco too.
Yeah.
But if you look at least in my country, if you look at countrywide, it's really rare. There's only a few choice neighborhoods that are really getting gentrified. But if that's your neighborhood, that matters to you. And I think that one of the things that happens in gentrification is wealthy, affluent families have been so successful at saying no to any kind of affordable housing that pressure gets downwardly pushed, right? Mm. And so then you get kind of, moderate or low-income neighborhoods accepting that housing, and often any kind of housing, right? And so that's when gentrification happens, not because, developers target those neighborhoods just because, but because it's like this scarcity mindset that has pushed them into those neighborhoods to allow for gentrification pressures. So notice how weird that is. If we were designing a city, we wouldn't be like, okay, we're not going to do this in any of these affluent neighborhoods. We're just going to do it in these neighborhoods, and then we're going to push those people out. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to do something that's more citywide, something that's like New Jersey. That's not just about we should build it, but we should build it everywhere and everyone should pitch in. And if we all pitched in, we wouldn't have so much gentrification pressure on these communities that are facing it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a really brutal image. You started with a burning building, but of course we had Grenfell Tower as a burning building in the city not many years ago, and Sheikh Bajal in the richest postcode probably in Europe, and it was very much a housing issue, but also an empowerment issue. The tenants there were not being listened to. So how else do we ensure that the movements that we build empower poor people to lead them and to have their voices at the forefront? And what else can we do to empower them other than just say they have to lead the movements? Right,
yeah. I think that, this is a really critically important question. And I think that in the US, the organizations that are doing this the best are organizations that are making this bet that the progressive voter doesn't want kind of a watered down compromise with, well, this is good enough, this good enoughism, but wants something inspiring and wants a language that's authentic. And that language often is the language that is spoken by people most connected to the problem. So if you look at like what the Working Family Party is doing in America, for example, they're finding local leaders in their community who are at the forefront of the eviction crisis or the labor crisis, and they're saying, gosh, you're good at talking about your story. You should run for city council. Like you should run for mayor. You should be on the school board. Let's build a movement around you. And they're building movement and political power by elevating those voices. Or you can think of an organization like the Economic Hardship Reporting Project in the US, which is like, okay, journalists, thank you for covering these problems, but we need people that have experienced these problems firsthand to be writing poetry and doing the journalism and doing the documentaries about that. So let's find folks that are interested in that. Let's give them training and let's give them a voice. And so that's something that like my shop at Princeton has invested in. So I do think that organizations that are looking at how to like build power from below are central. Yeah.
I might turn to you actually on that, because obviously the Labour Party is supposed to be a party that represents working class voice. And yet, well, I'm being a bit critical here, but there are fewer working class politicians now than ever before. How do we make sure that what Matthew's talking about there sort of is reality in our politics in the UK today? And actually, any other reflections you have on how the book is relevant for our circumstances in the UK? What's similar, what's different? Any thoughts on that generally?
Well, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And I'm a fellow Alan Lane Penguin author, and that's how I was connected with Matthew. And I read the manuscript of this book, and I can really recommend it to you. It's a very, very powerful piece of advocacy with lots of stories. I think storytelling is hugely important. This is not a dry academic in the wrong sense. This is not a dry, abstract book with just statistics and just technical language or overarching principles. It is animated by many, many stories, real people's stories. And so congratulations, Matthew, on the book. To take the second part of your question, I'm always happy to talk about internecine issues in the British Labour Party, but to take the second part of your question first about the comparisons between poverty in America and increasing inequality and poverty here in the UK. I think, unfortunately, there are too many parallels.
Yeah.
Now, perhaps if I had read this book or something like it a decade ago, or a bit longer, I would have done that sort of slightly, not smug, but slightly relieved, British progressive thing of going, oh, at least we have a welfare state, and at least we have legal aid, and at least our prison population isn't quite as high as that, and at least, right? And I'm afraid I can't do that anymore. And so I saw enormous, painful parallels when I read this manuscript with where we are currently in the UK and the direction of travel. And I think the direction of travel has been there for some time, actually, and not just under recent Conservative governments, but it's a much deeper issue. Whether you're talking about incarceration, we, in my adult lifetime, I'm in my mid-50s now, have moved away from a more European approach towards a much more American approach of let's build some more prisons and let's incarcerate more people. Matthew writes in his book very powerfully about erasure, about how you take poor people and you stick them in prison and they are erased, and then you don't count them in unemployment statistics anymore, etc., etc. We've so moved down that trajectory. I think racism is now worse in Britain than it has been for a long time. I think there probably was a time, maybe in the early 90s, when I thought things were much better in terms of race than they had been when I was a child in the 70s, for example, with the National Front and so on. I now think we're in a very bad place on racism again, both in terms of what it will mean in terms of poverty and inequality and in terms of conflict. When I think of these mobs of people outside hotels that are effectively incarcerating, housing, whatever, asylum seekers, angry mobs that have effectively been stirred up by political rhetoric, including from senior government ministers. That is pretty scary stuff. And it all really comes back to the divide and rule proposition, doesn't it? And what is optimistic and hopeful, I think, about the message in the book is the idea that if you actually start talking to people about the crux of their problems, about low wages, about wages being pushed down, about a lack of decent housing, whether social or otherwise, when you start addressing those concerns, then that's the antidote to the divide and rule politics, which is about, some people, let's be honest, getting richer and richer and richer, and so rich that they'll let this planet burn and plan their post-human future on Mars. You think I'm joking, but I'm not. You know what, right? So they're going to take their lovely Amazon and et cetera, model off to other planets by a combination of algorithms and robotics and whatever. This is insanity. And some people are writing in the academy and elsewhere in excited terms about the post-human future, and some of us are grappling with an inhuman present. Mm-hmm. And I think there are enormous I think, I have been so people talk about patriotism, and it very, very quickly tips into nationalism, jingoism, whatever, right? We're all supposed to be standing in front of Union Jacks the whole time, and if there's something that I could be patriotic about, and once was very patriotic about, it's the National Health Service, the NHS. It even has the word national in it, and lots of uniforms are involved, but not militarism, and not xenophobia, and not racism, because this is a thing that was actually built by people from all over the world. The Commonwealth, but later Europeans who came and worked in our health service. And look at how it has been undermined by accident and design and austerity over many years, and yet how valuable and essential it was during the pandemic, which I believe, by the way, the pandemic is a parable for every inequality and injustice on the planet that was just kind of magnified and brought into sharp relief by that. The NHS was this wonderful, one of the greatest progressive experiments, I would say, in world history, and now that is being undermined, and we're going to move, if we're not careful, more towards the American system of health provision, which I think is obscene. I'm sorry, it's just totally obscene that there are working people who don't have the right kind of work even, and the right kind of terms and conditions with their employers in the US who cannot pay for basic health care. It's a country where women do not, by federal law, get 1 day of statutory maternity leave. And women are literally giving birth and then thinking how quickly can they get back to their precarious employment. And Britain has moved more in that direction. Less unionisation in my lifetime. The membership of trade unions has gone down. It needs to go back up again. More precarious employment, more contracting out, less social housing. In every respect, we've moved further towards the American model and away from what I would consider more communitarian, benign societal models, whether in Scandinavia or some other parts of Europe. I'm not saying anywhere is perfect, but there are wonderful things to come out of the US. Don't get me wrong, in many ways advanced from the UK in terms of aspects of cultural melting pot, aspects of constitutionalism, all sorts of cultural things that we love about America, but not this model of organising the economy. And then as to the British Labour Party and whether it is really producing the kind of working class leaders that it needs, I think the rise of a professional political class is a problem. Yeah. And what you actually want is representatives to be of the people, to come from communities and represent those communities. You don't want people to be doing the circuit around the country choosing, the most attractive seat to stand. You actually want people to come up from communities. Now, that traditionally came partly through the trade union movement, and that is still a potential incubator of representatives, but it's just as valuable for political representatives to come from movements, other grassroots community movements, including race equality movements or social justice and climate movements. And I think that people who care about this should be investing, including financially, investing in building candidates up, in giving them organising skills, advocacy skills, the basic toolkit to be an activist and then perhaps even a representative. And that is an opportunity for
I didn't mean to put you on the spot,
Well,
but I
I'm
do,
putting-
because it's
I'm
also,
putting- I'm
frankly,
putting
it's
you
a
on the
problem
spot to
in the Democratic Party too, right? In the US.
Yeah,
Is
but in the US, I think
yeah.
we can learn from the US. I mean, we can learn
So
from
we
the US
have
too, because there are movements. When we saw the rise of the Squad, for example, and I watched that. I watched that documentary. Did you? Is it called Take the House, or the one where we see AOC and other? It's a wonderful documentary and demonstrates a model for people who care about this stuff, getting behind certain candidates.
Yes.
And working with them to get them elected, because they are the disruptors who are going to change the conversation from this rather technocratic managerial conversation of different white men in suits, and we're the red team, we're the blue team. And of course the colours are reversed in the US, but it just shows that, so we might as well be one Premier League football team that wear red in a city, and then the other Premier League football team wears blue in that same city, and sometimes we even transfer between the teams. But it's politics as almost elite sport, as opposed to politics which is about raising people up and changing the world.
So I'll give you, because there's a lot there, and I was wondering if you wanted to respond, or shall I before I turn to Pete, is there anything in that you really wanted to?
There's a lot in there. I think that our Congress right now is the richest Congress on record. And there's this massive social distance between people that are elected and people on the ground. I think you do have a similar story in Britain. The housing crisis is a great example. Many of your leaders, like Boris Johnson, for example, is a landlord, and other leaders are kind of on another side of the debate. So I think that we do need an electorate that looks like the country.
Yes, and I didn't know if you, I mean, obviously one of Matt's key arguments is around movement building, and at Citizens UK, that's what you do. And I think I was also curious if you wanted to reflect just generally on the links, or what you thought about the book, but also specifically, I know that Citizens UK is very focused on that integration question, trying to find those commonalities across communities, whether it's refugees, whether it's race, whether it's class.
Yeah, thank you. And again, privileged to be here, and really interesting to hear some of the work you've done. Again, what I love about it, I think, is the immersive nature. I know you were in Milwaukee and you actually experienced it, so it's not just a sort of cold sort of looking from a distance. And I'm a community organiser, and so I suppose I'm immersed in lots of communities across London, and a lot of the stories and the things that you talk about unfortunately resonate with me. I think one thing I would say about our democracy, and yes, of course, we should get more diverse people into Parliament, I completely agree with that. But actually, how do we democratise our democracy? How do we get our democracy to not be just something we do once every 5 years, but something that we participate in on a regular basis? There are tables right now in your community that people are sitting around making decisions on your behalf, that we should be around. We should be there, because actually democracy is something that happens on a daily basis. And I sometimes take some of our community leaders up to the top of the Shard, and I say, because you can, if you don't want to pay, to get to right to the top, you can go to the bar for free. That's what we do. And I get them to look out across London, and I say, what's going on? And they can see homes being built, they can see hospitals, they can see police happening, they can see things happening in front of their eyes. And I often say to them, things are happening. Things are being done to us. So we have a choice to either get a seat at the table or to sit and watch politics play out on our televisions. And ultimately, politics will find us. And it will ruin us, it will impact us, it will affect us. And organising is about how do you agitate people to realise there's something they can do. There's a table that they can be at. There's something that they can change, they can be a part of. And really that's what organising is about. And for me, I think the thing that resonates with me most is, you know, I often will sit down with a group of kind of community leaders in an area and say, what is the most serious issue affecting you? And we will hear some of the most horrible experiences, painstaking, you know, people who will show you the bites on their legs from the temporary accommodation and the bugs that live in the beds. We will hear people's story of not being able to put food on the table and the shame that that brings them. People who have been moved into temporary accommodation. I met a guy not that long ago in Lewisham who has got 3 kids, and this really resonated with me because his kids are around about the same age. He got moved out of the house, he got evicted, and he was told to move miles and miles away to Pinner, which is in North London, and he was asked to go and do that night. So he packed all of his belongings, he put his kids in the back of the car with his wife, he drove to Pinner, and when he got there was no one to let him in. That is disgusting. That is absolutely awful. And so he then took his car, he went all the way back to Lewisham, and he parked in a car park, and he slept in his car with his kids. And he said, I've never felt so much shame. And I think part of what we need to do is, how do you stop that shame? And the way you stop that shame is by telling people they can have power. Because you see, I often say at the end of that, the most serious issue affecting these people and affecting you is not those issues of injustice that you've named, but the fact that you don't have the power to change the injustices you've named. How do we give people power to be able to change these things? Sometimes in a small way, sometimes to do with the fact that they've got damp and perhaps on their own they can't do it, but if they work with other people on that estate, then they can change it. But also with big things as well, like the Living Wage campaign is a story of people working together who had said enough is enough. We don't want to live in the shadow. You know, it started in Tower Hamlets, where you've got Canary Wharf, you've got the biggest businesses, you know, people earning an absolute fortune, and in that shadow you have some of the poorest communities in London. This was the birthplace of the Living Wage campaign because people said enough is enough, and I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do something about it. And some brilliant stories of people taking power back. So when you come to I love your thing about the fire, but the question is, how do people get a hose? And it can't be just me giving them a hose, because does that give people dignity? How do they take a hose for themselves? I might have a role to play because maybe they can't put the fire out on their own, and maybe I can get a hose and I can use that from the outside. But we've got to give people and teach people how to be democratic on a daily basis and how to have the power to transform the injustices that they see on a daily basis.
Yeah. Did you want to respond, or shall I turn to the audience?
I just love that. I mean, one of the things that I think that we have to do is, you know, there's this phrase in America that people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And often the solution that folks that are on the spear tip of these problems come up with sound to some of us who are not facing hunger and scarcity and eviction crazy. And it's interesting how, like, the dreams of the rich sound like reality. Like, what if, like, we didn't pay taxes on wealth? Like, okay, like, that's like law now, you know? Or like, you know, well, what if we could go to Mars or build this giant skyscraper in the city? And the dreams of the poor often sound like outlandish or pie in the sky. But I was spending, right before the pandemic hit, I spent about 1.5 years with a tenant rights group in Minneapolis, which is in the middle of the country. And they had a negligent landlord. And so they started mobilizing against the landlord. They got the city to revoke his license. And then they went on rent strike after that. They stopped paying him. And they were like, they went to the landlord, they're like, we want to buy your buildings. We want to buy your buildings. And the landlord's like, okay, it's $7 million. And they're like, okay, cool, we'll be back. And so they start raising this money. They start going and raising this money. And the landlord is getting increasingly agitated and aggressive. And it all comes to a head. They kind of raise the money, but the landlord files to evict all of them. And it comes to a head, and it actually is a jury case for an eviction case. And the first tenant to be heard was this woman named Chloe Jackson, who was working for $15.69 at the airport at the time, where she slowly but surely got involved in this movement and became a leader. And her eviction case was up, and we broke. And I was hanging out with a tenant group, and there was this woman named Takara, who was one of Chloe's closest friends. She had a tattoo on her face. She was rough. She was she was tough. And she said, it's taken this jury so long. They're asking themselves, why do these tenants want this raggedy building? It's because people have forgotten how to dream. Mm. And I was so convicted when she said that. And now I was like, have I forgotten how to dream? Have I tailored my policy prescriptions to these little things? And I think that, and they won. They won the eviction case. They bought the buildings. They turned it into a co-op, and they're living there today. And so I think that, often things are impossible until they're not. And I think that people that are, like the folks that you're working with and organizing, kind of know that. So the things that we can do, I think, is to meet them where they are and be like, all right, let's go after this big, crazy idea. So.
And I think in that, sometimes the dream is unachievable, and it's how do you cut the dream down into something that's manageable? Because I think what often makes people feel hopeless is the sense that I've tried a big dream and it hasn't worked. So when we started a campaign, for example, in Wandsworth with a bunch of residents who wanted to completely replace all the windows because the damp was absolutely awful. You could literally put your hand through some of the...
Jeez.
And there were 3 or 4 of them when they first met, and it was like, you don't have the power, to be able to compel the local authority or the housing association to do this. But what do you have the power to do? And what else is angering you? And one of the guys was like, the door at the front of our estate has not been painted in 10 years. Huh. And the others were like, yeah, that's true. Why hasn't it been painted? So that's where they started. They started and they went to the housing association. We taught them about power, and they went and they negotiated, and they said, can we have our door painted? And they were like, well, yeah, of course you can. Yeah. When that happened, they invited, they called another meeting, and this time they invited a bunch of other people because they'd seen the door had been painted and it had given them hope. When you were in that room, you would have thought they'd won a war. I mean, they were so proud of what they'd done.
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
People need milestones. This is a long road. You need milestones along the way, and you need to celebrate that success and really taste it and hang on to it before you go on to the next struggle. Because there are the doors that you didn't get, there are the defeats and the struggle. But I was also listening to both of you and thinking, to be blunt, about corruption in local government. When you talk about shame, shame is something that the poor are feeling when really the shame should be located in other places. Yeah. And I think when you're talking about Tower Hamlets, what is going on in some of these local authorities, whether and in local government, whether in city government, whether in the UK or the US, when the big money comes along and the big developers come along, and suddenly everybody's voting for this kind of, I don't think we talk about that enough, actually. I don't think we're honest about, because we're all for, localism is great and local government is great and let's all stand for the city council, but we also need to be sometimes exposing some of the stuff that is
and not even corruption. I mean, the case you said of the housing, I've done some research and kind of looking at why poor people are disempowered. And on the left, there's this tendency sometimes to blame the 1% or the capitalists, but it's actually often, sadly, a housing officer. The sort of immediate source of them not living the life they want is not a banker in the city, but is rather someone who hasn't left the key so that the person get in the house. And one of the things that troubles me, and it does link, I think, Matthew, to your argument, is the way in which disrespecting or dehumanizing the poor has even been, is a sort of widespread phenomenon. We've had so many years of sort of calling them skivers, calling them shirkers, that actually even not just immigration officials, but housing officials are behaving in such a way.
And the benefits agents. When I was a young lawyer 30 years ago, there were people who worked in what was then the DSS and is now the DWP, who had gone into that work because they believed in a welfare state based on entitlement, and where if a benefit has been allotted to someone, it is their entitlement, and the public servant working in what was then the DSS, is now the DWP, had a duty and a professional role to impact. You know, these were public servants who saw themselves as enablers,
Yes.
not as the cops that are there to trip people up and sanction them. So when you talk about personal responsibility in your book, I think that, I mean, I do believe in the need for structural change, no question, and I do believe in the problem with the 1% and everybody, I really do believe in that. But nonetheless, in terms of milestones along the way, the individual responsibility kicks in because there are people in public service as well as people in NGOs and trade unions and who have a role to play in their personal, daily, professional decisions as well as in organising and longer term campaigning.